Jinny is the chief China economist at ICBC Standard Bank. I asked for her reading of the figures.
Well, I think across the industrial production, investment, and also investment not only in the state-owned enterprises sector, but also in terms of the private sector, pointed downwards. So growth in activity is across the board weaker compared to previous month. But that's not something of a surprise. I think the surprise is the fact that recent policy action to ease the current, for example, rate of interest, the RRR cuts recently we saw, and also some administrative measures to try and curtail the impacts from power outages hasn't really had an even more broad-based effect across the real economy. So I think what this set of data, weaker set of data, really points to is probably further action by the policymakers to ensure that growth doesn't lose momentum even further.
And COVID, of course, still very much part of the picture. What sectors are feeling it most?
So state-owned enterprises, larger enterprises are benefiting on the back of some measures to cut the cost of commodities, for example, but certainly private sector who are dependent on household consumption are really feeling it. As we see in the retail sales data, for example, that confidence of household to spend, even heading up to the Lunar Chinese New Year holidays, is still relatively nascent. So I think that is the key worry, whether household consumption will hold up and whether enough can be done really to boost spending by households.
And we've seen supply chain disruption and a global shortage of microchips. What has that meant for China's production?
Whether it's the tech sector, global supply chains, what it meant is also that China is putting in force even more measures in terms of trade, because obviously new cases of COVID are appearing still domestically in China, despite the great efforts put in by authorities. So what that means is probably even further impacts on global supply chains in the months ahead. And of course, it will impact on a lot of sectors across China, not the least, of course, the auto sector, which is already seeing the brunt of the impact. But heading into Lunar Chinese New Year, of course, what we may see is that domestic brands will be preferred, for example, because of those global supply chain impacts. However, the trade sector is actually one of the outperformers in the recent cycle, mainly because actually the resilience of China in global supply chains is that there's not many alternatives to Chinese produced goods, especially processing goods. So I think trade performance will continue, but perhaps those supply chain disruptions will mean some global impacts in the months ahead.
And what about the property sector? We know about the problems for Evergrande, for example. What effect is that having?
Well, the recent Economic Work Conference reiterated that properties are for living in, not for speculation. And we saw, of course, a weakening investment and property sales in the sector. So what that is effectively having is that, of course, people are still staying away in terms of investment in the property sector, whether it's equity, debt related. And of course, property developers themselves quickly trying to restructure their existing debt or their existing portfolios in order to make sure that a lot of the debt is sustainable. So it's having a positive impact in terms of reforming or reshaping the sector, particularly in terms of the indebtedness. But the property sector itself, I think, going forward, will have a healthier outlook because prices are falling, and of course that improves the affordability of housing. But of course, across the board, property sector will become less bubbly. So the reduction in terms of asset bubbles may, in the longer term, be positive for the industry as a whole.